Okay, so good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our class this evening on the intertestamental period. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Herods. It's really kind of hard to believe as we get into this that this is the 11th class in this series. Who'd have thought? Way back in March when everybody went off on spring break, that schools wouldn't open back up again and churches would end up having to cancel their worship services, and we'd be doing Bible classes like this on the internet. 11 weeks later, here we are. Let me just say that as we get into this, I anticipate that this class is probably going to go until the middle to late part of July. That's about when we're going to run through the material that I would really like to run through in this format. And so we'll go until about that time of the summer. I know that as we get into the summer, we're probably going to have fewer people joining us just because people get busy with things that are going on in the summer. That's understandable. But I would anticipate about the middle to the end of July for us to cover pretty much the things I'd like to cover in the remaining part of this class. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Herods. If you're joining us here on Facebook and you have a Facebook account, you can actually make comments on the video. So if you've got some questions that you'd like to ask or some comments that you'd like to make, go ahead and type those into the comment box there underneath the video on your device. And I'm watching this on my iPad. I'll look over there, hopefully see those comments and be able to respond to them during the course of the study this evening. We're going to be talking about the Herods tonight. If you saw the announcement on Facebook, you know that's what we're going to be talking about. That's what I told you last week we were going to be talking about tonight. This is one of those kind of topics that really just catches the tail end of the intertestamental period, gets us more appropriately into the New Testament period, but it's also one of those topics that there's a lot of confusion about. It's kind of like if we were to have a Bible study on the pharaohs of the Bible, which we're not going to do. I'm just going to say that. But if we were, a lot of kings in the Old Testament, kings of Egypt, are just identified as the Pharaoh. We get to the New Testament, we begin to kind of have the same thing going on with the Herods. We get this Herod and that Herod, and which Herod are we talking about? So this evening, in the time that we have, we're going to talk about the Herodian Dynasty. We're going to talk about these kings that came out of this dynasty, several of whom are mentioned in the New Testament. I think probably all of them, don't quote me on this, I think all of them are at least mentioned in passing with the exception of one in the New Testament. Some are more significant than others in the New Testament. We're going to be talking about several this evening. The names are going to be a little bit familiar, but we're going to conclude the class tonight with a family tree that'll kind of help us to put all of these folks together. So let's go ahead and spend some time talking about the Herodian Dynasty, the roots of the Herodian Dynasty. It really begins in the Hasmonean period, and you may remember from previous classes that the Hasmonean period refers to that time after the Maccabees are successful in their revolt against Seleucid rule. They establish a dynasty. We know that dynasty as the Hasmonean dynasty. And so the Herodian family and their dynasty really begins in the Hasmonean period. There was an individual whose name was Antipater I, or Antipas. He was appointed governor of Idumea by Alexander Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus being that Hasmonean monarch. He appoints Antipater I to be governor of Idumea. Remember, Idumea were these folks that lived to the south of Judah. They were Edomites. They're the descendants of the Edomites of the Old Testament. They're descended from Esau. And these people had been forcibly converted to Judaism. And so Antipater I is this individual that's going to be governor over these folks, but under the authority of Alexander Jannaeus, the Hasmonean monarch. So it really goes back to this period where we start to see this family rise to prominence. Now, following that, we have Antipater II. Antipater II is the father of Herod the Great. We're going to get to him. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about Herod the Great this evening. So Herod's father was Antipater II. He was involved in what was going on with the Hasmoneans as well. In fact, it's Antipater II who instigated Hyrcanus II's flight to Petra. That laid the groundwork for Roman intervention in Judea and really is going to end Jewish independence. They're then going to be a part of the Roman Empire. Antipater II was also an individual who supported Julius Caesar. Because he supported Julius Caesar, he was made a Roman citizen. and was appointed procurator, governor of Judea. And so Antipater was a pretty good politician. He kind of saw which way things were going, realized that Julius Caesar is probably, at least for a while, going to be victorious. And so he makes friends with him. He supports him. He gets to be a Roman citizen, and then he gets to be appointed to this position in Judea. At the same time, he makes his own son Herod governor of Galilee. And then he takes his other son Phasael and makes him governor of Jerusalem. So again, Antipater II is a pretty smart individual, because when he gets this position as procurator of Judea, Roman governor of Judea, if you will, he makes his son Herod a governor up there in the north, and he gets his son Phasael to be governor of Jerusalem. So they are solidifying their position here in this area and with the Jews. So that's Antipater II. We talk about these folks. We think about Phasael. Phasael is important, but not terribly important from a New Testament standpoint. But this son Herod that's made governor of Galilee, he's the one that's going to be really, really important, because that Herod, of course, is the one we otherwise know as Herod the Great. Herod the Great is going to rule as governor of Galilee from 47 to 37 BC. So for 10 years, he's going to be governor of this region in the north, mostly inhabited by Jews, but not exclusively inhabited by Jews. He's going to be governor of Galilee. Herod learned well from his father. Herod was the kind of individual that was loyal to pretty much whoever was in power in Rome. There's a lot of stuff going on in Rome at the time, a lot of instability going on back in the mother city, and Herod can kind of see that probably it's going to be pretty important for me to be really loyal to whoever's in power in Rome. And if I'll do that, it will allow me to keep my position. So he's able to do that. He's a very good politician. He's appointed king of Judea by Mark Antony. That is the Mark Antony that we think about when we think about Cleopatra. Octavius, later known as Augustus, Octavius and the Senate join in with that appointment, and that happens in about 40 BC. So Mark Antony, Octavius, and the Senate make Herod the Great king of Judea in 40 BC. It's significant that he gets the title king. He's going to be a client king. He's going to be a king who is working underneath Roman authority. In the Roman Empire, when they were annexing and establishing new territories, they would often rule through puppet kings. They were called kings. Sometimes they got other titles. We'll see some of that this evening as well. But they were really under the control of the Roman government. They were not independent in any real sense of the word. Now, Judea during this time had been in a state of rebellion and civil war. You may remember that from previous classes. And so although Herod the Great is made king of Judea, he's actually got to capture his country. So the first thing he does is he recaptures Galilee, and then he captures Jerusalem in 37 BC. So we date Herod's reign as king of Judea, not from 40 BC, because although that's when he gets the title, he's got a country that's in rebellion and he can't really reign over it. He's going to be able to do that then starting in 37 BC. So from 37 BC, we date his kingdom. And he's going to be king from 37 to 4 BC. Herod, in addition to being a pretty good politician from a political standpoint, he was also a ruthless ruler against rivals. And I put that in quotation marks because it's really that he was ruthless against anyone that he perceived to be a rival. So if Herod looked at you and he thought, hey, this fellow might cause me some problems, chances are you were going to fall in his crosshairs and it was not going to end well for you. So for example, in 35 BC, he had Aristobulus, his brother-in-law, murdered in Jericho. Not in prison, not banished. We're just going to murder this guy and get rid of him so he can't cause me any problems. That takes place in 35 BC. Then in 29 BC, he executes his own wife, Mariamne. Don't worry about getting a divorce. Don't worry about sending her off somewhere. I'll just execute her and get her out of the picture. And so he does that in 29 BC. As we get later to the family tree, you'll see that Herod actually had about 10 wives. And so he had quite a few wives that he was married to. But he executed Mariamne in 29 BC. Then he executed his mother-in-law, Alexandra, in 28 BC. So you just see a progression here of people that he viewed as rivals, and he's just going to get rid of them one right after another. Well, you look at Aristobulus, okay, it's his brother-in-law, not blood. You look at Mariamne, well, you know, married couples sometimes fall out, and there's a lot of dynastic troubles going on. You see that he killed his mother-in-law, and maybe that doesn't look extraordinarily strange as well. I'm saying that in a very sarcastic way. Please understand that. But in about 7 BC, he kills 2 people that we wouldn't expect at all. He executed his own 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. That happens in about the year 7 BC. So you see a progression here as Herod makes moves against anyone that he thought of as a rival. Now, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, boy, that sounds really familiar, because the Herod the Great that we know from the New Testament was kind of that way, you're right. Because what we read about in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 2, verses 16 through 18, is that when the wise men come from the east and they want to find out where the new king has been born, and Herod finds out where he was supposed to have been born, in Bethlehem, he sends his soldiers to kill all the baby boys of Bethlehem to make sure that he's going to catch anybody who could possibly be the next king of the Jews. Herod was ruthless. He also ordered leading Jews to be held and executed upon his death to ensure that the nation would mourn. So here's Herod. He knows the Jews don't really like him. He knows he's made a lot of people mad. He's made a lot of enemies. He's executed a lot of people. When he knows that the time of his end is coming, he makes sure that a whole bunch of these leading Jews are arrested and they're held. He gives the order that when I die, you go and you execute all of those folks, so that at least the Jews are going to be mourning, even if they're not mourning for me. And so that's the order that he gives. Finally, we see in the year 4 BC, 5 days before his own death, he executes yet another son, this time Antipater. That was his son by his first wife, Doris. Just a few days before he dies, he executes another son. Now, that's interesting. People outside of Herod's family and outside of Judea understood what this fellow was about. In fact, Caesar Augustus said this. He said, I would rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son. I want you to think about that statement for just a minute. Augustus said it'd be better to be this guy's pig than his son because the Jews don't eat pigs. And so chances are that pig is going to live. Sons of Herod don't have such a great chance. So even pagans, heathens, if you will, understood that Herod was pretty exceptional in his ruthlessness. All right, let's pull up a map for just a moment, showing us Herod's kingdom, the extent of his kingdom. If you look there on the map, I'm sure this is showing up, at least I hope it's showing up well on y'all's display. All of those, let's see if I can, maybe I can get, there we go, there's my highlighter. All of these green shaded areas are areas that Herod controlled. They're a part of Herod's kingdom at its greatest extent. These circles, these hollow circles, mark places that he was building. And so we see some places beyond Jerusalem. We see Herodium down here by the Dead Sea. We're going to see some pictures of that in a moment. Masada that we talked about in our last class down here by the Dead Sea as well. Machaerus, we're going to see some pictures of that later. Those are fortresses down along the Dead Sea. He's solidifying his territorial claims here in the area. So he's able to keep his territory. He's able to have some building projects. We're going to go back to those in just a moment. But of course, like all people, he dies. And he dies in the year 4 BC. I might just point out here that we talk about dating the New Testament. We talk about when was Jesus born. We need to understand that our calendars are off a bit, okay? Because Herod the Great is clearly alive when Jesus is born. That's what we read about in Matthew chapter 2, and the text is very explicit. We also know that on our calendars, Herod's death occurred in 4 BC. So when the calendar was being created with the years before Christ and the years after Christ, and it was decided what the year 0 would be, there actually isn't a year 0, there's a 1 BC and a 1 AD, the folks that did that just got it wrong. They based it on the information that they had, but they just got it wrong, okay? So Jesus was probably born sometime between 6 and 5 BC, maybe as late as 4 BC. Jesus was most definitely not born in 1 AD because Herod is already dead at that point in time. So let's continue on talking about Herod, because he makes some plans for his death. He does have some sons that are alive, believe it or not. He did not kill them all. And in his final will, he established, or his desire was at any rate, that his son Archelaus would be king. His other son Antipas was going to be tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. And then yet another son, Philip, was supposed to be tetrarch of Gaulonitis, Trachonitis, Batanea, and Paneas. So that's what Herod set out in his will. That's what he wanted to have happen. He wanted to have his sons ruling in various areas. Well, when you're the king of Judea, but you're under the Romans are the ones who are going to decide whether or not to accept that will. And what ends up happening is that Caesar Augustus actually accepts the will, but the exception that he makes is that he denies Archelaus the title of king. That might not seem very significant to us, but it was significant in the ancient world because it means that Archelaus is not going to have anywhere near the power and prestige that his dad had had. Okay, so we get Archelaus. He's not going to be king, but he is going to reign over an area. Antipas is going to be tetrarch. Philip is going to be tetrarch. So Herod's kingdom gets divided. So let's pull up another map. We're going to see this map several times this evening. This is the result of Herod's will and, of course, his death, is that the kingdom gets divided. So we have up here in the north, in that kind of yellowish color there, that's the territory of Philip. Then you have, we can just ignore the Decapolis. That doesn't get controlled by anybody, at least from Herod's descendants. Then we get over here, this blue area in Galilee and Perea. That's the area that's controlled by Antipas. And then finally, this green area, Samaria and Judea and Idumea, just south of Judea, that's the area that's going to be under Archelaus's control, at least until 6 AD. So we're going to talk about all of these rulers here in just a moment, one after the other. But let's say something else about Herod before we go on. Herod died in Jericho in spring of 4 BC. That's a date that's pretty well established historically. The Jewish leaders that he had imprisoned with orders that they be executed, no. These folks, when they knew Herod was dead, they're not going to execute these Jewish leaders. So they released them all. So I guess you could say there was at least a certain amount of rejoicing when Herod died. Herod's body is then buried at Herodium. We're going to see a picture of that in a moment. But before we do the pictures, we need to talk a little bit about what Herod is also known for. He was a ruthless leader, but he was also an ambitious builder. And some of the projects that really stand out historically that come from Herod, and he really spent a lot of effort and money in these projects, one of those was Caesarea Maritima. We're going to see a couple of pictures of that in just a moment. This area of the world, this area of the Mediterranean really does not have, Jewish area of the Mediterranean, really does not have a very good harbor, a very good port. It hasn't historically had a very good port. Herod wants the Jewish realm, his kingdom, to have a good port, and he's going to build one. And he builds it at Caesarea Maritima. He also works on the temple in Jerusalem. That starts in 20 BC, and it's still under construction or had just barely been finished by the time Jesus begins his ministry many years later. He also builds fortresses, the ones at Masada, Herodium, Machaerus, plus others. And so he's got a lot of building projects that are going on in his kingdom. And many of these have stood the test of time and can be seen today. So let's pull up some pictures. The first of these is an aerial view of Caesarea Maritima. That simply means Caesarea by the sea. That's what that Latin word means. This is the harbor. At least that's what I want to point out. But I'll just point out while we're looking at the slide that there's some other things that we're going to see close-ups of in a little while. And one of those is over here. There's a theater. And that theater is large enough that you can actually see that pretty clearly on the aerial photo. That's the theater. We'll come to that later in the class. The harbor itself, though, is right over in this area. And there's actually an inner harbor and there's an outer harbor. And you can see that outer harbor marked with those darker colors underneath the water. That's marking where the stones are. If you're going to build a harbor and you don't really have much of a natural one, what you have to do is you have to dump a lot of rock in the ocean. And so that's what Herod does. He builds this outer harbor. You can see the outlines of it there in darker blue by piling up a lot of rocks. And those rocks, of course, break the waves so that ships that are in the harbor are protected from the sea. The harbor at Caesarea was supposedly large enough that the entire Roman navy could anchor in it at once. Now, I don't know whether that's true. I don't know whether anybody can actually test that, but apparently those who study history and know the size of this harbor know how large the Roman navy was in the entire Mediterranean. They've indicated that in that outer harbor plus the inner harbor, the entire navy could have anchored. It is a significant feat to build a harbor that's that large when you don't have a very large natural harbor there already. And that's what Herod does. This is very typical of Herod. Herod, when he gets it in his mind that he's going to do something, nothing is going to hold him back from accomplishing what he wants to accomplish. So a politician, ruthless against his rivals, and an ambitious builder in his kingdom. Part of Caesarea Maritima also was the aqueduct. The aqueduct was important. We talked about that in an earlier class because Caesarea didn't have enough fresh water to support its population. And so water is brought by aqueduct from miles away so that the people living there would have fresh water. And of course, huge part of that aqueduct is still standing today, testament to his ambitious building plans. Here's another photo. This is of Herodium. This is one of those fortresses that he built. You look at that from a distance, and if you're looking at that, you might be thinking that's a volcano. Let's look at it from you might also be asking, where's the fortress? Let's look at it now from the air. There's the fortress. There's the fortress up on top of that hill. Let's look at another shot of Herodium. This time looking straight down, and you can see the towers and the remains of the wall. Again, this is an artificial construct up on top of this hill. It's a fortress. One of the other fortresses that Herod builds is Masada down by the Dead Sea. We remember that in the Jewish revolt, the Zealots went down there, and it took the Romans a long time to get them out of that fortress, to kill them, to destroy them. Well, they committed suicide to conquer the fortress, I'll say it that way. Herodium was that kind of fortress as well. It would have been very, very difficult to take. From Herodium also, we have the remains of Herod's tomb. That's that structure right here in the photograph. That's all that's left of Herod's tomb there at Herodium. And of course, Herodium takes its name from its builder, from Herod. Let's look at another project that's pretty significant. That takes us to the city of Jerusalem. Remember, I indicated that Herod began building the temple in about 20 BC. There had already been a temple there. It had been built when the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity. But it was a rather small temple. And Herod, because he was really proud of himself and really proud of the kingdom, really believed that he needs to build a bigger temple. And so he made plans to build a bigger temple. The problem came when it came to him, or when it was just pointed out to him, whichever the case may be, that the temple that he was planning to build was going to be too big for the mountain where it needed to be built. And so a lot of other folks, probably if they were given that bad news, would have said, well, let's draw up some other plans, make the temple smaller so it'll fit in the space that we've got. Not Herod. Herod says, nope, if the mountain's not big enough for the temple, we're going to make the mountain larger. And that's what he does. He takes the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and he enlarges it. He enlarges it by building retaining walls. And those retaining walls, you can see them very, very nicely right here. Those retaining walls then allow him to fill in those areas and enlarge the mountain so that then he can build the temple where he wants to build it at the size he wants to build it. And so we have remains of these through the centuries that have lasted that we see even today. Let me pull up the next photograph. This is of those retaining walls. Now all of this up here, if you see those smaller bricks, I don't know if that's showing up on your devices or not, but if you see those smaller bricks and smaller stones, those are all stones that date to later reconstruction. It's down here that you have the Herodian stones. Those are all the rocks that were put there so that Herod could enlarge the Temple Mount. I don't have a picture of a human being here in the picture itself that you can see, but if you will go right over here, there's some kind of a container there. You might see the steps over here. That'll give you an idea. The steps here, by the way, that's a cemetery up there on the right. But you see these steps. That'll give you an idea to scale of how large those stones are. Those are massive stones. This is a project not unlike the pyramids. Herod's going to enlarge the mountain. He has these stones cut and brought in and laid together so that the mountain can be made larger. And these stones are still there today in spite of all the subsequent history. Now, if you see a picture today from Israel of Jews who are praying at what's called the Wailing Wall, sometimes the news will report that the Wailing Wall is all that's left of the temple, and that's why the Jews go there to pray. That's not entirely true. The Wailing Wall is actually a part of that retaining wall. So it's not actually a part of the temple. It's a part of the mountain on top of which was the temple. So it's a little bit inaccurate when the media reports it that way, but I guess for sake of space, that's what they need to do. But that's it. That's what remains of that retaining wall. And it's pretty massive. Let's pull up another picture. This is not a photograph, but a diagram of some of Herod's projects in Jerusalem. So we have over here on the right side, circled in blue, that's the Temple Mount. The temple's back there behind it. A lot of other buildings are built there. And of course, you see at the bottom of that, the retaining wall. You might also see that there are some gates going into that retaining wall, okay? It wasn't just solid. There were some spaces in there as well for storage and other things. The other thing that we note here on the map is Herod's palace. And so over here in this part of the city, he builds a magnificent palace that size-wise would have been smaller than the temple precincts, but wouldn't have been a whole lot smaller. Herod was an ambitious builder. He thought he was a great king, and he wanted everyone else to think he was a great king. And great kings and great countries build great monuments to impress people with their greatness. And that's exactly what Herod's doing. All right, let's look at another diagram. This is just another diagram of the temple area. So you've got the temple itself here in the center. You've got all these courts that are around it. You've got the retaining wall here. You've got the various entrances. I might point out that right over here, just on the edge of it, is the Antonia Fortress. The Antonia Fortress was built there so that a garrison could be kept very close to the temple, because Herod understood and the Romans understood that if there was a rebellion among the Jews, chances are it would have something to do with the temple. And so a fortress was built very close by and garrisoned with Roman soldiers, or at least Herod's soldiers, to make sure that there wouldn't be any problems in the temple. Again, to give you a little bit of an idea of scale, let's pull up the next slide. I think it might be a little bit better here. So you see the temple itself. The temple here, some of the outer courtyards and some of the storage buildings, and you see the artist has given us some people as well to give us reference. Herod's temple was truly massive. It was an incredible architectural feat, and it was a gift, if you will, of Herod to the Jewish people. I'm not sure that Herod was particularly concerned with pleasing God, but he was most definitely concerned with pleasing the people that he ruled over. And so he built this temple, and it would take a very long time to be completed. In fact, it's not completed during his lifetime. All right, so that's Herod the Great. As we indicated, when Herod the Great dies, his territory gets divided up in accordance with his will. The Romans accept that, and so we have to talk about each one of these fellows individually. And the first one that we're going to talk about is Archelaus. Archelaus receives from the Romans the title ethnarch. The title ethnarch simply means ruler of the people. It's not as prestigious as being king. King is a different title. King is reserved for the ones the Romans really want to bestow some honor on, for whatever reason they might choose to do that. Archelaus gets the title ethnarch. He's going to be ethnarch from 4 BC to 6 AD. He is actually mentioned also in the New Testament. He's mentioned in Matthew chapter 2, verses 20 through 23. We don't have time to read all of these references this evening, but hopefully you can go back and reference that later on your own. Matthew chapter 2, 20 through 23, we have Archelaus. mentioned in the scriptures. His rule was characterized by brutality and tyranny as well. Archelaus learned very well from his father what it meant to rule. Because of that, a delegation was sent to Rome. That delegation consisted of Jews and Samaritans. And they go to complain to Augustus concerning Archelaus's rule. And if you know something about the history of hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans, you can kind of appreciate the fact that these two groups get together to make this delegation to go to Rome because they are so unhappy with how Archelaus is running things. And remember, this is a time frame that Jesus is alive. Jesus was a young boy during these days, and so Jews are suffering under Archelaus's reign. His brothers lodge complaints as well. They're ruling in other areas, but they recognize that what's going on down there is not a good thing, and what's not good down there could end up not being good for us. And so they complain about Archelaus's rule. So the Romans receive this delegation, and the result of that being that they decide we got to get rid of Archelaus, so we're going to banish him to Gaul. He's actually banished to the city, what's now the city of Vienne, in modern France. And so that's Gaul. Gaul is this area that's now France. He's banished to Gaul. It's basically on the other side of the Mediterranean that he's going to go, so that he's not going to cause any more trouble there in Judea. His former domains are made a province under the rule of Roman governors. So now what you've got is you've got some of Herod's sons that are ruling in some areas, but now you've got Judea and Samaria that are being ruled by Roman governors. And of course we see that because when Jesus is put on trial, one of the people he's put on trial in front of is Pontius Pilate, who's the Roman governor. There's some other trials that are going on with some of the other rulers in the area, but in Judea, that trial takes place, or one of his trials takes place in front of a Roman governor, because Archelaus is out, the Romans are just going to have governors there ruling Judea. They recognized that the province was a troublesome province. The Jews were not happy under Roman rule. They felt a need to make sure it was ruled well to keep things from getting out of hand. All right, again, just a map, showing where Archelaus was ruling. It is the green area here. So he's ruling over Samaria, Judea, of course, Jerusalem, and Idumea south of that. That's all of his territory until he loses it in 6 AD. All right, one other photo to show to y'all. This is from the modern city of Vienne in France, where he had been exiled to, ancient Gaul. This is the temple of Augustus and Livia. And if you happen to get to France, to that part of France, and you happen to go there, you can see this today. It's been very well preserved. It was a temple not built by Augustus and Livia. That's not what it means when it's the temple of. What it means is it was a temple that had been built for the worship of Augustus. That was the Caesar. And Livia, his wife. Emperor worship has a long history in the Roman Empire. And it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible that Archelaus actually sees this with his own eyes when he gets to Gaul and gets to that city where he's been exiled. All right, let's turn our attention then to another son of Herod, and that's Antipas. Antipas is made tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. And he's going to be in that position from 4 BC to 39 AD. Significantly, he's going to be in that position the entire life of Jesus. Okay? So the entire time that Jesus is alive in Galilee and is preaching and teaching in Galilee, it's going to be in an area that's ruled by Antipas. That's going to continue on to 39 AD, which means that the early days of the church are going to, in this part of Judea, in this part of Palestine at any rate, are going to be with Antipas being ruler. Antipas rebuilds the city of Sepphoris, and he later establishes his capital at Tiberias. We talked about Sepphoris earlier, that it was the Roman capital of Galilee. It was about an hour away from Nazareth. A lot of building going on there. Entirely possible that Joseph worked on the building of that city because he was a carpenter, and carpenters were construction workers, and even possible that Jesus went and worked there just because of the magnitude of the building project. All right, Antipas, that's speculation, by the way. We don't know that for a fact, but it's entirely possible. Antipas is not given the title of king. He's tetrarch. But he did receive the dynastic title of Herod. Okay? He is most known, most famous, or I would say most infamous, for the imprisonment and then beheading of John the Baptist. That's recorded in Mark chapter 6, verses 17 through 29, plus parallel passages. It's also recorded in Josephus in his book Antiquities. The reference is there on the screen. Book 18, chapters 116 through 119. So John the Baptist is not written about only in the New Testament. Josephus writes about him as well, and they record the fact that John the Baptist had been imprisoned and then eventually beheaded. The issue was that Antipas had his brother Philip's wife. John the Baptist knew that wasn't right, pointed it out to him. And Herodias was not happy about that. And eventually her daughter, who we know from outside of the Bible was named Salome, danced before the king, pleased the king. The king made a rash promise. And the mother said, well, what I want John the Baptist's head. And Antipas does that. So this Antipas is that Herod that did that to John the Baptist. All right, let's look on a little bit more about that. Not about that, but about Antipas. Several people close to Antipas figure into the New Testament. So in Luke chapter 8 and verse 3, we read about Joanna, the wife of Chuza. And then in Acts chapter 13 and verse 1, we read about Manaen. These were people that were close to Antipas that are mentioned in the New Testament. Again, he's reigning up there in Galilee and Perea from 4 BC to 39 AD, the entire period of the Gospels, okay, and much of the early chapters of the book of Acts. He did, in Luke chapter 13, verses 31 through 33, make a threat to kill Jesus. That's obviously not carried out at that time. Then finally in Luke chapter 23, verses 6 through 12, we read about his involvement in the trials of Jesus. What's going on there is because Jesus was from Galilee, Pontius Pilate kind of hands him off to Antipas. Okay, you see about this because he comes from your area. And then he ends up coming back before Pilate. So Antipas is involved in that trial as well. Eventually, Antipas is exiled also to Gaul, to a city that was called by the Romans Ludinum Convenarum. The French call it Lyon today. I think that's a whole lot easier to say. He's exiled because of accusations from Agrippa the First. So let's pull up that map again and show his area of reign. Antipas is ruling over Galilee. So that's up here. Includes the area on the western shores of the Sea of Galilee. He also gets Perea, which is down here. And of course, those two areas are separated by part of the land belonging to the Decapolis. Decapolis means 10 cities. It was a separate political division. And so his two areas are separated by somebody else's area in between. But that's the areas that he reigned over. So anytime Jesus or the apostles are doing anything in Galilee, they're in areas that are controlled by Antipas. Let's pull up another photo. This is of Machaerus, which is located in modern Jordan. Let me go back and see if I can point that out on the map. I think it's there. Yes, it is. So Machaerus is down here in southern Perea. So it's on the opposite side of the Dead Sea from Masada. Masada is on the western shore. Machaerus is on the eastern shore, and it belongs to Perea. It was one of those fortresses that Herod had built. Antipas inherits that because it's part of his territory. It looks an awful lot like Herodium. You can see that. What's significant about this is the New Testament doesn't tell us where John the Baptist was imprisoned. And it doesn't tell us where he was executed. It tells us he was executed in prison, but he doesn't tell us where that prison was. Josephus, though, does. Josephus tells us that John the Baptist was being held at the fortress at Machaerus, and it's there that he's executed. Again, that's not inspiration. That's Josephus, a Jewish historian of the first century. No reason really to not think that his information is accurate. All right, another photograph. This is also, we're going back to France, to the other side of the Mediterranean. This is from modern Lyon. It's the theater and the Odeum. So you have in the foreground here the theater, the Roman theater, and then in the background you have the Odeum over here. That's simply the smaller theater. And so those are buildings that quite possibly he would have seen as he's there in exile. We sometimes think of exile as always being a bad thing. It certainly was for the Apostle John when he was on the island of Patmos. I suspect for some of these Roman rulers, they had built up quite a bit of wealth, so getting banished to southern France probably wasn't viewed as the worst thing that could possibly happen to you. All right, let's turn our attention then to Philip. Philip is tetrarch, and he's tetrarch from 4 BC to 34 AD. He rules the northern areas of Herod the Great's domain. Mostly his areas were populated by Syrians and by Greeks. Not a whole lot of Jews living in the area that he's actually going to rule over. He does rebuild and enlarge Paneas, Caesarea Philippi. So we actually read in the New Testament of Jesus being in that area. He's in the precincts or the area around Caesarea Philippi, and he asks a very important question. He asks, who do people say that I am? And of course, it's in that context that Peter makes that wonderful confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's all happening in the area around Paneas, Caesarea Philippi, area controlled by Philip. Now, Philip married Herodias' daughter, Salome, but they had no children. He dies in 34 AD. His territories are annexed to Syria, and then in 37 AD, Caligula, that's the Roman emperor, assigns his territories to Agrippa I, who is Herodias' brother. We'll see all of this kind of laid out for us when we look at the family tree at the very end of this presentation this evening. All right, let's pull up that map again, showing us Philip's area. And a lot of it's actually off the map, but it's way up here in the north. You see Caesarea Philippi there. The little bit is on the northeastern shores of the Sea of Galilee. So Bethsaida might have been in his territory. It's right on the border. That's the area that Philip controlled. And remember, Jesus passes around Caesarea Philippi at least once during his ministry. All right, let's then talk about Agrippa I. Agrippa I is king. He's king from 37 AD to 44 AD. So after the time of Christ, but well within the apostolic period. So the period of the New Testament, the period of the book of Acts. He was the son of Aristobulus and the grandson of Herod the Great. He did during his reign incur a great deal of debt. So Herod is very, very wealthy and he builds great things. His grandson comes along and he's pretty much heavily in debt. He's imprisoned in Rome by Tiberius, the Emperor Tiberius, but then he's released by Caligula because he had made friends with Caligula. And so when Caligula comes to power, he's actually able to release Agrippa. He receives the territory of Philip the Tetrarch, that's that northern area, and he also receives the title of king. So it's Herod's grandson that's going to be called a king once again. He received Antipas' territory as well after he gets banished to Gaul. So let's look a little bit more at Agrippa I. In 41 AD, Caligula is murdered. This isn't good. After all, Caligula and Agrippa are friends, so what's going to happen? Claudius becomes the emperor after Caligula. Claudius, however, confirms him in his rule and adds to it Samaria and Judea. So Agrippa I, if you will, kind of dodges a bullet here because Caligula is now dead. Claudius is the new emperor, but Claudius is going to let me continue to be king, and he adds more territory to my kingdom. So now I'm going to get Samaria and Judea as well. What's interesting about that is Agrippa I, Herod the Great's grandson, now rules over basically the same territory as his grandfather had. From a Christian standpoint, from a political standpoint, biblical standpoint, I should say, we also note that Agrippa I was a persecutor of Christians. We read about that in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 19, and then we read about his death in Acts chapter 12, verses 20 through 23. Why don't we go ahead and take our Bibles? We haven't read many of these references this evening, but I think we've got time to read this. Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12, let's go ahead and find verse 20. We read earlier in the chapter about the persecution of Christians, and then we kind of get at the end of the chapter, well, God deals with that, okay? So this is what we read. This is Acts chapter 12, starting in verse 20. Now Herod, that's Herod Agrippa I, okay? Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him with one accord, and having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace, because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed, I'm sorry, I just dropped my spot. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered an oration to them. And the people were shouting, "The voice of a God and not of a man." Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. So we have Herod Agrippa the first. He's on his throne. There's an assembly of the people. The people are there from Tyre and Sidon, and they start proclaiming him when he starts to speak, and he gives a speech. That's the voice of a God speaking. That's the voice of deity speaking. Agrippa doesn't correct them. He accepts that praise. God strikes him, and he's eaten by worms. Now, interestingly about that, Josephus records this as well. In his record, he tells us that it happened in the theater at Caesarea Maritima. Remember, I showed that earlier on that aerial shot. Well, is there a contradiction here between Josephus and the New Testament? Absolutely not, because when the king would go into the theater, there'd be a special place there, a special seat for him, a special throne for him, where he would sit to watch whatever the show was, or in this case, the assembly of the people. So no contradiction at all. No contradiction between what Acts tells us and what Josephus tells us. This is in all likelihood the very same theater where Acts chapter 20 happens, the end of Acts chapter 20. Agrippa is struck with worms and he dies. So we read about his ending in the New Testament. Finally, we have one last Herod we need to talk about, and that's Herod Agrippa II. He is king from 50 AD to question mark. We don't know exactly when he ends his reign as king. All we do know is when it starts. We know approximately when he died. We don't know exactly, though, when he died. So I put a question mark on the slide. He is the last of the Herodian line. When he's dead, that's it. No more Herods are going to reign, okay? He is the son of Agrippa I. That makes sense since he's Agrippa II. He received only some of the territories of his father. Now, Agrippa II was incestuously involved with his sister Berenice. And we read about these two in Acts chapter 25 and Acts chapter 26 because Paul makes his defense before them. Agrippa and Berenice, brother and sister, incestually involved. Not a good thing, but they hear Paul's defense. Agrippa II then, when the Jews revolt in 66 AD, Agrippa does not side with the Jews. He sides with the Romans. He supports the Romans during that revolt. And so after the revolt is suppressed, he's able to continue as ruler of his territories. He, again, like many of the Herods, he made a good choice as to which side was going to be on, a good political choice as to which side to be on. He died sometime between 93 and 100 AD. But for some reason, the historical record is not complete there, and we don't know exactly when he died. All right, let's pull up the family tree. Those of you who know me know I like to do family tree research. I like simple family trees. There's nothing simple about this one. So this is the Herodian family tree. We see Herod the Great up there at the top. He's king from 37 BC to 4 BC. Herod had 10 wives in total, okay? Not all of those wives are important from a dynastic standpoint. There are 4, however, that are. There is Mariamne I, the mother of Aristobulus, who is the father of Herod Agrippa I, who is the father of Herod Agrippa II. Then we have Mariamne II. He had 2 wives named Mariamne, okay? So the second Mariamne is over here. She's the mother of Herod Philip. Then we have another wife whose name was Malthace. She's the mother of Herod Antipas and also Archelaus. And then finally we have Cleopatra of Jerusalem. She's the mother of Philip the tetrarch. Okay, Herod the Great is the father of all of these. So what you might note is that when we talk about Philip the tetrarch, we talk about Archelaus, we talk about Herod Antipas, these 3 that reigned, okay, they are, well, Herod Antipas and Archelaus are full brothers. Philip the tetrarch is half-brother to them. Herod Philip is half-brother to Herod Antipas and Philip and Archelaus. And then Herod Agrippa over here, the first, and Herod Agrippa the second would be, I guess they would be grand nephews, but step-nephews of these other folks, because we have these wives that are in the picture. They're brothers. They're in reality stepbrothers or half-brothers, if you will. All right, let's notice something else about this family tree, and I want to go a little bit slow to keep all of this kind of straight. So we have Mary Amity II. She has the son Herod Philip. Okay, Herod Philip marries Herodias. Okay, who then is going to end up with, and I think I said earlier that it was Philip the tetrarch's wife. That was incorrect. It's this Philip here, who is married to Herodias. Herod Antipas then convinces Herodias to leave Herod Philip and come live with him. And so she is married. Her second husband, if you will, is Herod Antipas. All right. Herod Philip is the father, biologically, with Herodias, of Salome. And Herodias is Aristobulus's daughter. So that would be, and I may get this wrong, guys, but it looks to me like Herodias is actually his niece. And she's also Herod Antipas's niece. Salome then is the daughter with Herodias. Salome then is the one that dances in front of Herod Antipas. John the Baptist is executed as a result of all of that. Salome then later marries Philip the tetrarch. They don't have children. All right. If that's not complicated enough, then you have Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I has got daughters, Berenice and Drusilla. Drusilla, his daughter, marries Antonius Felix. Antonius Felix is the Roman governor of Judea from 52 to 60 AD. This is the Felix that we read about at the end of the book of Acts. Paul appears before him as well. So he's married to Herod Agrippa I's daughter. Berenice isn't really married to Herod Agrippa II. They are brother and sister, but they are involved in an incestuous relationship. Dynastic family trees are always complicated, and the Herods were no exception. But of course, you see a lot of things going on in their family. You talk about dysfunctional families sometimes. I would have to say that Herod the Great's family is pretty much a good example of a dysfunctional family with all that's going on here with Herodias, with Salome, and with Berenice. All right, so those are the Herods. That's about all that I wanted to talk about this evening in this class. We've gone for quite a while. I appreciate your patience. This is pretty much the last class in this Bible study where we are going to talk about history. From here on out, we're going to talk about some themes that come from the period. And so what we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about some Jewish writings that come from the period between the Testaments. Intertestamental Jewish literature, not the Old Testament, not the New Testament, but some of the literature that's written between the two testaments, I should say, and some of the literature sometimes that shows up in certain editions of the Bible that certain churches use. And so if you're a little bit curious about that, come back next Thursday night at 7 p.m. I realize it's a Thursday before the July 4th weekend, but hopefully it's early enough before July 4th that no one's traveling yet. You'll be able to tune back in and we'll have this Bible study again. Thank you again for tuning in this evening. I do appreciate it. I know your time is valuable, precious. I know you're busy. I do appreciate you being with me this evening. If you have some questions that you think about later, you want to shoot those to me, just send me a message and I'll try to get you an answer as soon as I possibly can. Thank you all again. I hope that you'll have a good rest of your evening.